And now, from God's Unchanging Word Studios in New Orleans, we are pleased to bring you news, nuggets, and insights with today's host, Tom Carey.
Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to God's Unchanging Word in another edition for our news, nuggets, and insights. And today is Friday, July 23rd, 2021. And as always, we've got a powerful program. I got a lot of stuff lined up today, so don't go anywhere. We're going to talk about being self-imposed. Self-imposed what? Self-imposed global governance on the U.S. You ain't going to believe this. This is pretty dangerous, what's going on here. The European Union growing into a superstate. These actually, believe it or not, as we're going to get into it today, actually are merging together for an end-time prophecy, and that's why this is so important. Then we're going to talk about the second wave of removal of ancient Israel. That ties into self-governance, having other nations come in and govern America. So don't go anywhere. We got a lot to talk about. Let's begin with a couple of small stories, as we always begin with. I call them small because they didn't even make the news. Last week, in USA Today, they declared war on a men's Christian group. Wasn't even in the news. In fact, when I went to see how the event went, I couldn't find anything there. Audrey and I talked about it, and I said, well, maybe they canceled the event. But it was actually there. USA Today columnist demands that Dallas Cowboys Stadium cancel the Promise Keepers event. This was a group that was really big and popular back in the 1990s, trying to restore value to the home, as they call it today, the nuclear family that they're trying to get rid of, trying to make the family the way God designed. And there'd be 80, 90,000 people that would attend these events, trying to strengthen the home. Well, now they're declaring that these people are racist, that they're homophobes, and demanding they couldn't even rent the stadium. USA's Race and Inequality editor called the Dallas Cowboys and the AT&T Stadium, where Promise Keepers was set to take place this weekend, to ban the Christian men's movement. Well, it actually took place, but it wasn't anywhere near what they thought it would be. But to the surprise of everyone, Promise Keepers says it has changed. The times have changed. So the nuclear family that they were trying to develop, here's what they said. In an interview with the Religion News Service in April, after the banning of Paris, Harrison said, everyone, including gays and trans men, are welcome at our Promise Keepers, and we're not intending on bashing anybody. Well, the door has now been opened, and they're going to begin to make way into the new wave of a new world that God hates, that he's coming back to destroy unless it repents. Absolutely amazing. So now, this is another very, very important story. Iran says that the U.S. has agreed to move 1,040 sanctions from the Trump era in the nuclear talks. This is what Israel's been concerned about ever since the election. The Biden administration is considering lifting the sanction on Iran's supreme leader as part of the negotiations aimed at reviving the 2015 nuclear deal, a former U.S. official and two people familiar with the matter told NBC. In a speech just before being sworn in as premier, the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett expressed staunch opposition to the American return to the deal. This is the deal that was set up way back in 2015 to allow Iran to begin to enrich its nuclear capability. But ever since that time, they've been enriching anyway, far beyond what they really need. They're actually enriching to a nuclear warhead capability. And as we know, Israel says they're never going to let them have one. So all of these things, as you're going to see today, everything continues to merge into an end-time scenario that you and I need to stay on top of. The border continually is out of control. U.S.-Mexican border apprehensions for the fiscal year has just surpassed 1 million people. Can you imagine that? 1 million people in June. That means we still have another half a year to go. Another half a year to go. So they're expecting the apprehensions to be able to come across the border this year, somewhere around 2 million people in just 1 year. Federal officials have logged in 1.1 million apprehensions on the border in the fiscal year after just another busy month in June. It was a record-setting 189,000 apprehensions. This doesn't count how many gets away. It doesn't count how many people are coming across who are criminals. And they've been catching a lot of those here recently. 2006 was the last time the border apprehensions topped 1 million. I went back looking all the way back because there wasn't a lot being said as far as I remember back in the 1990s. But in 1994 to around 1998, these apprehensions they were 1.75 million people even back into the 1990s. So this just continues to be this wave of immigrants just continually illegally coming into the United States. So now, let's move on from that. We're going to cover more about that because, see, Cuba now has this crisis. And what's really amazing is that the administration, the Biden administration, was very staunch to let them know, don't you dare enter that water to try to enter the United States because we're not going to let you in. It's amazing how they would take such a stance there, but let everyone coming in from South America and the other countries around the world coming in where they think they'll get the votes from. Totally, totally political. So we're going to talk more about that. This is another, I want to talk about this for just a second. Let me give you a heads up. This is a disgusting story. All right? You know, I've cleaned it up, but here's a story I want to tell you. It's going to be about 2 minutes long. The video is only a minute and a half because I took a minute and a half out because I said, you know, I can't even show this kind of stuff. I'm going to tell you why I'm sharing this kind of stuff. Right now, this is what's being taught to children, our youth, your children, your grandkids, whether you realize it or not. If they have a cell phone, if they're having social media, all of this information is being spoon-fed into their heads. When you hear kids talking about the trans and we talk about how rotten that is, when you hear children say, what's wrong with that? Then you know you've crossed the line. So what we're trying to do here is make everyone aware of what's actually taking place in the degeneration of our society for the sake of our children. This is a story where the transgender couples marry. All right, then they have a baby. Now, in the video, so let me show you this. I put this up here, they and them. In the video, they're talking about they and them. I'm thinking maybe they had, a couple. They had 2 children or triples or triplets, so, but they're neutral gender, so they can't say he or she. So they're talking, when they're talking about this little baby being born, as they and them, a single baby, so that you wouldn't get confused, because I got totally confused. Not only was I totally confused, I've got, in this transgender, what you're about to see, so I'm giving you the setup so it would begin to make sense, because your mind won't wrap around it. It is a woman who decided to be a male, and a male who decided to be a woman, and they married. Well, now the person that used to be a female that is now a male is now carrying a baby, but he's a male. And the male, who's now a woman, is upset because he can't produce the milk for the baby. And you can't make this up. This is becoming commonplace. All right, let's play that video.
In Washington, D.C., a Hanu must give birth without their midwife present.
Something's coming. Something's coming.
The baby. I don't know what to do.
Keep it under water until it's all the way out, okay?
Oh no, they're trying to come out.
It's okay, baby.
They're completely out. Can I bring them out?
Yes. Oh my gosh.
They're so cute.
Are they breathing?
I don't know.
I don't hear any crying, and that starts to raise the blood pressure. Like, I know I should be hearing them cry by now.
Come on, babe. Put them on me. You tell them I'm on their back. Roll them and rub me right there. Come on, babe.
The first sound my baby makes is just, it feels earth-shattering. Like, if I weren't already sitting down, it would have me on my knees. But it felt really, really good to finally hear them.
The baby has been able to latch, but I've not been able to produce any milk. It's okay, because we're gonna supplement the feeding with formula so that my baby's still getting the nutrients that they need, but I'm still feeling hopeful.
What do you say? That's cleaned up. That's normal. That's becoming normal, and everybody praising it's making news around the world. Unbelievable. Well, let me show you something. And it's like, this is not just one of those just to disgust anybody. Let me show you what's coming next. It's out there right now. The new pregnant male emoji. In case you don't know what that is, that on social media you can put a little picture out there. So what they've got is the male now carrying the baby versus the woman, and then they got a male now carrying babies in any race, color, creed, you name it, they're out there. And this is being passed around to the children. You need to be aware of it. We as God's people need to put a stop to this kind of stuff. Do the very best you can, protect your children, to do what you can, because you see, when you think it can't get any worse, it does. I could not believe what that was. And I cut that down to a minute and a half just not to discuss to everybody. So now let's, we did our part. I just wanted you to be aware of that. So let's move on. All right. So you see all these things, they all tie in together, because now I'm going to cover the drought, because the mega drought continues. This is the proverbial frog in the boiling pot. So when we've seen from 2015 where the United States allowed gay marriage couples, it went berserk. I mean, it went crazy. You name it. It wasn't just gay people getting married. It went out the box with all the genders and you name it that's out there. All of these things bring on curses from the eternal, whether they realize it or not. And you know what? This world takes these curses and calls them climate change. It's the proverbial frog in the boiling pot. So as that continues to worsen, the society begins to accept it more and more and more. That you're on the outside now. You're the guy who's going to be coming after, because you are now the radical that has to be silenced. So it has continued to boil into now everything has been reversed. And as you saw in that little proverbial, the scripture had on the bottom, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. You saw that. So now let's talk about the results of this proverbial frog in the boiling point. In 2022, they're now predicting that the U.S. will produce less food. They're saying that it is also possible that they may not have enough food to export if things continue to deteriorate the way they are. All around the world, the food supplies, the food banks are getting less and less and less. So the fire keeps boiling, the frog's enjoying himself, and while you can still go to the grocery store, there's people now beginning to suffer and starve all around the world. It just hasn't happened here yet. These things are coming. So we need to think ahead. We need to begin to plan for what God says when years of lean take place, whether it's 7 full years, 3.5 years of tribulation, you know it's coming. And so we need to be ourselves on focus for what is coming upon this world. Now, I'm giving you an urgent plea today, because you see, as these things continue to happen, and the drought that I'm about to show you now is a continuation of a couple of stories we've already done this year. Over in Europe, they had massive floodings where almost 200 people drowned in Germany and Holland and some of the northern Scandinavian countries because of flooding. So let's play the first video. I got 2 videos for this.
The American West was once seen as a place of endless possibilities. Grand vistas, bountiful resources, and cities that somehow grew out of deserts. Now Manifest Destiny has become a manifest emergency. A scorching drought made worse by climate change is draining reservoirs at an alarming pace, fueling massive wildfires and deadly heat waves, and withering one of the most important agricultural economies in the country.
I'm really concerned, really worried.
Joe Del Bosque has been growing melons and other crops in California's Central Valley since 1985.
These are melons right here, cantaloupes and honeydews.
He's weathered droughts before, but nothing quite like this.
That's right. Well-watered field. It's been watered very efficiently.
And this looks like a completely different world over here.
This is a fallow field.
He showed us this field of dirt. There's not enough water to plant a crop here this summer.
How much of your land have you left unplanted this year?
About a third.
A third?
Yes, that's significant. If that water doesn't get here, we will start to lose our crops. Some of our crops will probably die.
Del Bosque's water comes from the San Luis Reservoir, which is at just 30% of its capacity. The state has now cut water deliveries to many of its farmers, who supply much of the nation's fruits, nuts, and vegetables. Del Bosque paid for water he now can't get.
I'm sure you talk to your neighbors. I'm sure you talk to farmers up and down the valley. What are people saying?
Well, a lot of them are worried and a lot of them are mad. If we have no water, we can't farm. If we get no water next year, these trees won't get water. They're going to die.
This devastating drought is not confined to California. It's impacting nearly all of the West. The red and brown colors on this map are what the government calls extreme and exceptional drought.
This drought is really bad.
Park Williams is a hydroclimatologist at UCLA. He says this is not just one long, hot, dry summer, but instead it's what scientists call a mega drought.
This is really the 22nd year of a long drought that began in the year 2000. There are some rings that are thick and some rings that are thin.
Williams and his colleagues know this from studying the rings on trees, which show how much they grow in any given year.
So you can literally look at how close the rings are and say there was a 2-year drought or a 20-year drought.
In the West, we can actually do this with our eyeballs. The last 22 years actually rank as the driest 22-year period in at least 1,200 years, based on tree ring records. And so humans now are contending with a water limitation crisis in the West that modern society in this region has not yet had to contend with.
The only reason that's nothing really seems drastic right now because you can still go get food. The people in the West still have water. I got another. I'm going to give this one in just a second. This goes along with the other video. This again was on Sunday morning this past week. What the mega drought means to the American West. The mega drought means that the American West farmers are dependent upon water from river systems in the American West, seeing massive cuts in their supply, as you just heard, as the reservoirs drop to their lowest levels due to the worst drought to hit the region in 1,200 years. Without this water, places like Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles are not possible. We're talking somewhere around 30 million people. 30 million people. And look at this reservoir. You see the picture at the top. You see how low it's dropped at the bottom. And now we got a video about the reservoir and the water supply. Let's play the second video, Jeff.
We've long known the limitations of the arid West. In the mid-1800s, the U.S. government sent geologist John Wesley Powell to survey the western U.S. water supply and bring back recommendations.
He warned that the West did not have enough water for a really widespread population, and we kind of bent the rules along the way when we started figuring out how to dam up the Colorado River and divvy it up to the western states.
The 726-foot dam, towering from the canyon bed of the Colorado, is the 8th wonder of the world.
Hoover Dam, an engineering marvel, was thought to be a concrete solution. It harnessed the mighty Colorado River and created Nevada's Lake Mead, still the nation's largest reservoir. This water supply is what made western cities such as Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Las Vegas possible, and allowed us to create some of the richest farmland in the country. But the predicted water supply from the Colorado River was based on 20 abnormally wet years at the beginning of the last century. Now 40 million people in 7 states depend on it.
We did it, we built it, we've become reliant on it. So we have to deal with what we have.
Pat Mulroy is the former head of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. We met her on the shores of Lake Mead, which has sunk to its lowest level ever. In the year 2000, the water came right up to the top of Hoover Dam. During the mega drought, the lake has dropped more than 140 feet.
So when it loses this much water, to me that is an enormous wake-up call.
Next month, the federal government is expected to make an unprecedented decision, declaring a first-ever shortage on the river, triggering cuts to the water supply in Arizona and Nevada that will cost some farmers 25% of their water.
So it's a tipping point. It's an existential issue for Arizona, for California, for Nevada. It is a river system and a water supply that cannot fail.
And so without this, are places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Los Angeles possible?
No, absolutely not. They're not possible. At the end of the day, this is gone, and those cities and that economic base is in dire jeopardy.
What do you think happens then? 30 million people to 14 million people, as they said in that video. It's already dropped 120 feet. If they don't have water, those cities can't supply the water for all those people. It's something we better take serious note of what's coming, because this has been going on and on. Now, I want you, when you finish this program, back it up to that chart that they showed you about the drought growing, because that's the first time I've seen the drought running across almost the whole top of the United States, working its way to the east, then the very tip on the east of the United States. So the drought, instead of being from California to the west, is now gradually making its way across the country. Something very much we need to take up and be aware of. God predicted this time would come in the book of Amos, chapter 4. I had also given you cleanness of teeth in all your cities. I mean, there was a lack of food. Cleanness of teeth. They had you don't have to go brush your teeth because you hadn't eaten anything. And a want of bread in all your places, yet you have not returned to me, says the Lord. And also I have withholden the rain from you. Yep. Climate change. Because people will not admit there is a God. God says, if you're obedient to me, I will give you rain in due season. We haven't had it since, they're talking now, this drought since 2020. We've had periods before that. And remember the Dust Bowl. We're moving back to that. Verse 7, and I've also withholden the rain from you, and when there were yet 3 months to the harvest, and I caused it to rain on one city and caused it not to rain upon another, and one piece was rained upon, and one piece where it rained not withered. So what God's saying is, like, I'm gonna spot this rain around, and that's what we're looking at right now. The east is getting rain. The southeast is getting a lot of rain, like we've been having here. I couldn't even hardly walk on my lawn and get into the car to come over here this morning without sogging to sound like a swamp in my front yard on the lawn itself, because we're having so much rain where they're having droughts. So 2 or 3 cities wandered into one city. Just imagine that. 30 million people, where are they going to wander to? Just as in the Dust Bowl, they all headed west, they're all going to be heading back east. And how will this country ever deal with that? Can you imagine what's coming? The hatred that's out in the world today, and the mindset that what I want, I take, which is being approved when people say it on the news and the government doesn't say anything to stop it. So, God goes on and says, so they wandered into one city to drink water, but they were not satisfied. It says, yet you have not returned to me, says the Lord. So you're living in this time in the book of Amos, chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. What else is being growing? The curse of the homelessness, right? The homeless and the cost for housing. I don't know if you saw this story. It's been out for a couple months, but we've not covered it yet. So I wanted to bring it out here because I've got a new video from PragerU. This is an excellent video about homelessness. Over 580,000 people per night are homeless. The nation's homeless population grew last year for the 4th year in a row. In a single night in January 2020, there were more than 580,000 individuals homeless, a 2% increase in the year before. This is 4 years. Now, if you remember, we were told in 2020 that we're the most productive, the best time, the richest nation, any time in history. But also during that time, the homelessness continued to grow. There's a cause and effect for all of these things. In San Francisco creates its own tent city. Look at the cost of this. This is absolutely insane. Only in San Francisco can $61,000 tents, the cost to maintain. See that picture that's up there? This is like a little tent city that they built for the homeless people. But to maintain each tent costs $61,000 a year. I'm not making that up. And to put the toilets, to be able to house them when they go to the toilets, $350,000 per toilet to install it. San Francisco is paying $16.1 million to shelter homeless in 262 tents. 262 tents cost $16 million a year. And that's 262 tents. Around the country, they're saying there's 580,000 people. You do the math. They also get services for food. Oh, well, there you go. They get to feed them, too. The price tag, $61,000 per tent per year. Amazing. This is unacceptable and unaffordable. All right, let's play this video by PragerU.
What do we do about the homeless? This is one of the most vexing public policy problems we face. If you live in a big city, especially on the West Coast, you literally face it every day. And every day it seems to get worse. Why? Let's start with a couple facts. First, the word itself is misleading. Homelessness is not primarily a housing problem, it's a human problem. The primary drivers of homelessness are drug addiction and mental illness. According to data from UCLA's California Policy Lab, approximately 3/4 of people living in cars, tents, and on the streets suffer from serious mental illness, drug addiction, or both. Second, despite these conditions, the homeless actually make rational decisions about where they want to live. Not surprisingly, they move to the most permissive environment they can find. Make your city attractive for the homeless, and they'll beat a path to your doorway. The Venice Boulevard underpass on the border of Los Angeles and Culver City brings home this point. It's one of thousands of concrete structures in Los Angeles County, but there's a curious detail. The Los Angeles side is full of tents, and the Culver City side is empty. Why? Because the two cities have different public policies. Los Angeles has effectively decriminalized public camping and drug consumption, while Culver City enforces the law. This pattern, that the homeless go where the policy environment is the most permissive, can be seen up and down the West Coast. In San Francisco County, it's estimated that 30% of the homeless migrated there after becoming homeless somewhere else. In the city of Seattle, that number is 51%. The San Francisco Chronicle estimates that hundreds of homeless individuals move to the Bay Area each year because of the perception that it is a sanctuary for people who are unwilling to participate in programs designed to get them off and keep them off a life in the streets. At first glance, this would seem to make no sense. Why would an individual with no shelter or stable source of income move to one of the most expensive cities in the country? But in the world of the homeless, it makes perfect sense. That's because they operate under a different set of incentives than the average citizen. In a research survey of homeless migrants in Seattle, 15% said they came to access homeless services, 10% came for legal marijuana, and 16% were transients who were traveling or visiting when they decided to set up camp. But this dramatically understates the biggest draw of all, the de facto legalization of street camping, drug consumption, and property crime. As former Seattle Public Safety Advisor Scott Lindsay has shown, the city is now home to a large population of homeless, prolific offenders, people who commit property crimes to feed their addictions, but are rarely held accountable for those crimes by the criminal justice system. So, is ever-increasing homelessness our inevitable future? If our goal is to make life as attractive as possible for the homeless, the answer is yes. If our goal is to actually help the homeless, the answer is no. Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner is a Democrat, but his approach to homelessness is a world apart from his counterparts in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle. It is simply not acceptable for people to live on the streets. It is not good for them, and it is not good for the city, Turner has said. Houston's policy is a perfect example of what Turner calls a tough love approach. The city has built housing for the chronically homeless, formed a coalition of nonprofit partners, and lobbied the state government for more mental health and addiction services. At the same time, Turner has enforced a strict ban on public camping and promoted a citywide campaign to discourage citizens from giving money to panhandlers. The results are as instructive as they are stunning. Over the past 8 years, Houston has reduced its homeless population by 54%, while it has skyrocketed in West Coast cities. Different policies, different results. Where a Seattle politician opposes hosing down feces-covered sidewalks because hoses are racist, Houston fights in the courts for the right to clean up encampments. Where California progressives push for more drug injection sites and have decriminalized thefts under $950, Houston imposes consequences not only for theft, but for aggressive panhandling, window washing, and other street obstructions. As this Texas city has demonstrated, local leaders in cities of any size can meaningfully reduce homelessness through a strategy that mixes compassion with common sense enforcement. If cities stop allowing public encampments and open drug consumption and start prosecuting property crimes, they will have much more success redirecting the homeless away from a life of self-destruction and toward a life of hope through mental health treatment, drug rehab, and job training. That's what we all want, isn't it? So why don't we do it? I'm Christopher Rufo, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Prager University.
And what he told you in that video is absolutely true, because right here where we're taped, we're in a parish called Jefferson Parish, who does not allow to be able to sleep on the streets or panhandle. But 2 blocks over, there's a canal. And on the other side of the canal is Orleans Parish, which is the New Orleans West Bank. In that area, they panhandle and there's homelessness, and homelessness all over New Orleans. But as soon as you cross that canal, the first light you hit, there's everybody at every corner on the red light panhandling for money. So what you just saw is absolutely true. All right, let's get into our 2 focus points today. First, in the World Watch, the self-imposed global governance on the United States. This is absolutely dangerous, what they're beginning to do. And I'm going to show you how deadly this is in our Nuggets portion of the program. This is the U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has requested the UN investigate the United States. So instead of having our own country govern itself, for the first time, they're asking the United Nations to bring in other countries to govern ourselves within our country. This is the second wave of warning of ancient Israel. There were 3 waves of captivity for ancient Israel. And we have been saying for the last 7 years that when we begin to see the second wave, you will know that we are marching closer to the time of the removal of our freedoms and our protection, just like in ancient Israel. The 3 waves. The first wave is the loss of money. Second wave is a loss of governance. In this insane government we have today, they are bringing other nations like Russia and China, Brazil, Cuba, to come in and monitor us, how we deal with other people within our own country. You can't make it up what's coming in. All right, let's get right into the story now. The transformation of America. Back in December 2020, we talked about the transformation of America and what would be coming if the Biden administration got in and who he was putting into office. Right here is a headline. China, not Biden, picks Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, which will dictate U.S. foreign policy. This man is a globalist. He believes the way to grow our country is through taking away our sovereignty and have us being governed by a world governance. So he's getting everything he wants now and he's bringing it in. Anthony Blinken has always been a globalist versus protecting our national rights. His desire is to move from a constitutionalist government to a global government. In other words, remove the Constitution. And you've been seeing the attack on the Constitution now becoming more and more often passing in this administration. He invites the UN to investigate America. The Biden administration is formally inviting the United Nations Racism and Human Rights Envoy to visit the United States. Human Rights Envoy? Cuba? China? Russia? Well, God says He's not going to give them a sound mind. He's going to give them reprobate minds. That's what you're looking at here. Amid a contentious, ongoing domestic debate over the treatment of the minorities in America. This is from the Wall Street Journal. U.S. Secretary welcomes Human Rights Council that includes Cuba, China, Russia, and Venezuela to opine in the systemic racism in America. Can you believe that? That's who's going to come in and tell them how rotten we are here in America. Did you see the recent rebellion going on in Cuba because they have no freedom of rights in Cuba? All right, let's go on. Is this the beginning of global governance? The United States Department announced on Tuesday that it invited the United Nations Racism Envoy to visit the U.S. amid the racial injustice, police reform, and the teaching of critical race theory in classrooms. Secretary of State Blinken also welcomed the adoption of a resolution in a Geneva-based UN Human Rights Council to address racism through a wide range of reparations and law enforcement measures. In other words, what they have passed over in Europe, we're going to bring in here to begin to enforce government regulations of Europe here in the United States. Will the UN also be the enforcer of the resolution? Now, that's a big question. Or will we hire more people in the United States to have another police force? Just like Adolf Hitler had his own guards, his own troops, the brown troopers, as they used to call them. Will they have UN security troops maintain the resolution as they do in other countries? In ancient Israel, giving up self-government was the second phase of them going into captivity. I'm going to address that in our Nuggets portion of the program today. I'm going to give you simply the background of the historical dimensions of what took place and the time today. I don't have time to get into everything, but we'll cover that portion of it. Along with that, the European Union now is growing into a super state. All of these things are biblically lining up to fulfill prophecy at the end time. So as the United States deteriorates, Europe now is beginning to come together into a super state. The EU political alliance, there's a coalition now to stop the super state. They know it's going on over there, and they are trying to stop it. On July 2nd, there was a joint declaration on the future of the European Union, which represents the first significant endeavor by Eurosceptic parties to jointly oppose efforts by European federalists to transform the European Union into a godless, multicultural super state. Sounds very much like a coming together of the 10 toes of the image in Babylon from Nebuchadnezzar. All right? This document states that the European Union requires profound reform because instead of protecting Europe, it has itself become a source of the problems and anxiety and uncertainty. All of these things are being rounded up, put together into the global reset. Who's been putting all this together behind the scenes? The Pope. He's put together enough companies that's worth trillions of dollars worth of investment and over 200 million employees around the world. That has been going on for the last 5 years. In April 2021, 27 EU member states, after 2 years of bickering, grudgingly announced a plan to launch a conference on the future of Europe that will invite EU citizens to contribute to the reshaping of their own future and that of Europe as a whole. So they're all announcing they're trying to come together, but in the middle of it, there's about 16 or 17 states who do not want this. Could it possibly lead to 10 toes? The last 10 toes. Many already believe that the EU's Conference on the Future of Europe has already been written with its conclusions. It seeks a forced federalization of the EU against the true will of the European nations and apart from the national parliaments of a divided Europe. Just like here in America, the government are passing laws that has no approval of the American people, but they're doing it anyway. Are we nearing the development of the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's image? And I believe we are. I think we're at the beginning stages. This is what we just brought out in the recent sermon that I just did this past Saturday. I'll tell you about more of that at the end of the program. This is the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw that Daniel clarified. The head of Babylon, the second of this image, his breast and his arms were of silver, talking about the Medo-Persian Empire. Then his belly and his thighs of brass, talking about the Grecian Empire. And the last, the legs of iron, and the feet part iron and part clay, talking about Rome. We're covering this right now in the resurrection of Babylon. Right now, I'm tell you about that at the end of the program. Right now, when we look at history of what God prophesied through this image, that this part of the image would be alive in extent at the return of Jesus Christ. According to prophecy, the end of these prophecies are all beginning to come to pass. It says, and here's the mind which has wisdom. This is Revelation chapter 17. The 7 heads are 7 mountains upon where the woman sits. 5 are fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. The beast that was is not, and even he is of the 8th, and the 7 goes into perdition. It sounds like a lot of, almost like it's a code that God's putting out. But we explained all this in the recent sermon. Let's get into what we're talking about today. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, of which have received no kingdom as yet, but will receive power as the kings with the beast. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings. They are the final connection to the 10 toes of the beast of Daniel. What we've been witnessing now for decades is the struggle of the development of the EU. Grown to 27, 28 states, Britain has just came out. Now they're beginning to break up to develop a super state around the world, which is going to pull the entire world together. You are at the beginning of that stage right now in the time that you and I live today. The church has always understood that these 10 horns to be the same as the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's image in Daniel 2, and has taught that they would come at the end time with a united European superstate comprising 10 voting nations. I'm bringing this out today because in the midst of everything that's going on, the United States is dying out. It's deteriorating day by day by day. And we're watching the rest of the world begin to mount up and rally around Europe, China, Russia, and so many other countries. We'll talk more about this curse of what's coming to place. As soon as we watch this video, we're going to come back, and in the segment, we're going to talk about the second wave of removal of ancient Israel. Take a look. Watch this video. Great little video. Great in the small, and we'll be right back.
Can you see it? There's so much great found in the small. A full life of potential in a heartbeat. A massive tree in an acorn. Trillions of atoms in a speck of dust. So much said in a look. So much history in a scar. So much comfort in silence. The faith to move mountains in a seed. The greatest gift in pennies. A timeless sacrifice in a few breaths. The greatest of man in a servant. The universe is great in the small. Stars 1,000 times the size of Earth, just specks in the sky. Salvation in the simplest of prayers. The gift of eternity in an instant. Freedom from bondage in a choice. Fullness of life in the darkest of times. Power of resurrection in a word. The greatest significance in the smallest of steps. Can you see it? May we all come to see the great in the small.
What a great little video. You know, if we have just the faith of a mustard seed, God says. All right, let's get into another very, very important portion of our program today. Let's get into the warning to the United States about the second wave of the removal of ancient Israel. Most people have no idea what we're talking about with this. But what God has showed us through history is that in the Bible there's a former and a latter, a physical and a spiritual. And by understanding what ancient Israel went through, we can understand the same patterns that's happening to America today. This is a prophetic calendar that I'm tying up here, showing the 7 times punishment of Israel. There are 2 very important dates that I want to try to bring out here. First, 745 BC is the beginning of Israel's captivity and going into exile. Like the United States, there was a beginning period that we began losing our freedom, and then there's going to be a final stage at the time of Jesus Christ. The first wave of their captivity actually began in 745. It was financial. It was absolutely financial. The final wave of their captivity is when they finally lost their identity. All right, so now we're going to begin talking about how this applies going through history and to America today. These 2 important dates, 745, the beginning of Israel's captivity and going to exile, 718, the final wave of Israel's captivity. So what are we looking for? If we got those 2 things, we know from history those 2 dates. The first wave and the final wave, but there's also a middle wave, which we're going to bring out in just a moment. So what are we looking for? We're looking for the final fulfillment of the 7 times removal of Israel and its restoration. How do we get that? We understand through history where we're at today. So you have the first wave of captivity, then you have the final wave. In Leviticus 26, God warns us and tells us there's a 7 times punishment. If you repent, then God will begin to restore your blessings. If not, there's 7 times more punishment, then 7 times more punishment. And we're going through those waves now that you're looking at in America today. When you calculate according to time, the way the Bible calculates time, God's calendar has 12 months, each month having 30 days, some days 29 days and so many hours and minutes. But over the course of the year, you have 360 days. 360 days times 7 years is 2,520 days. God talks about a day for a year. Prophetically, 2,520 days translates into 2,520 years of captivity, a day for a year. This is built into God's prophetic timelines. Because of Israel's continual refusal to obey God's laws, they would be punished without a homeland for 2,520 years. Just like Judah was in captivity for 70 years, ancient Israel is prophesied for 2,520 years. Just as they went into captivity in waves, they would also come out of captivity in waves. When? So that's what we're looking at. Now watch how this ties into America today as we go through this. Here's the chart that you just had. But to properly calculate time, there has to be added 1 year to everything in the AD column. Why is that? Because you see from 1 BC to 1 AD is actually 2 years, not 1 year. It goes from 1 BC to 0, then 0 starts to count forward to 1 AD. That's 2 years. But most of the time, theologians, when they calculate the time, they count this as 1 year, from 1 BC to 1 AD, not 2 years. So to properly calculate it, you have to add a year. So let me show you why I'm talking about this. The first wave of captivity, 745, less 2,500 years, brings us to the year 1775 on God's calendar of 360 days. Very interesting, 1775. However, if we add 1 year, it brings us to the year 1776, the beginning of the removal of the curses against Israel and the restoration of an end-time Israel. 1776, we know what happened that year. The Declaration of Independence, the July 4th, which, by the way, fell on Tammuz 17. It was the time of the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem. So even though God began the restoration of Israel's promises and blessings, it was established on the day of warning that if we ever turned our back on God, and even George Washington warned us in his address that if we ever forsook our God. An amazing story. Now, let's go to the final wave of captivity, 718 BC. When we move up, or we take away the 2,520 years, brings us to the year 1802. However, when you add your year to that, it brings us to 1803, the largest purchase of land mass in the United States history. And it opened the way to be able to move west to the destiny of America. The rebirth of Israel began July 4, 1776. And it began its final removal of curses in 1803 and opened the way for the United States. So now, let's take a look at this now in a more important warning for the United States today. 745 BC and 718, that should be AD instead of BCE. So I didn't change that. That's what we had in this original document and slide that was in the rebirth of Israel. So I don't go back and I don't change these, but that needs a correction, right? That's 718. I'm sorry, it is BCE. What am I talking about? That's not even there, so it is correct. All right, so now here's the scriptures that back these up, and I'm trying to get this through because I'm afraid we're going to be a little over time, but it's very important that you understand the warnings of how this applies to America, of what we're looking at today, and why it's so dangerous to have another country come into America to govern us. In 2 Kings 15:29, it talks about Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Israel, beginning to take captive the nations of Israel. 2 Kings 17, 5 and 6, and 2 Kings 18 and 19 also talks about that. Israel came through the land in a 3-year siege. That was the final 3-year siege of Israel. There are 3 successive waves, but this only gives us 2. It's because historians have missed the second wave, because they have misread this date as being the first wave that should be the second wave. I'm going to show you. That's from Bible history. That's what they've given to us, the fall of the northern kingdoms. So the end of all Israel occurred shortly after Jeroboam's death. The kingship was left to politically opportunists. They were all dwarfed by the powerful Assyrian monarch Tiglath-Pileser III around 745, where he placed Menahem of Israel under tribute. Right? Under tribute. However, that's the second phase. I'm going to show you. In the book of Ahaz, they talk about this. He says, and he carried the people to the northern territory of Naphtali captive in 2 Kings 15:29, but he still had to reckon with the resistance of Samaria and Peking, who murdered Hoshea and later made an Assyrian vessel. All right, so here we have another scripture documenting the Tiglath-Pileser 15:29. So now, what is this? Tiglath overthrew Damascus in 732. This is the beginning of a government authority moving. So you have a financial, then you have a government overturn, what you're looking at there. So what we're looking at is actually two phases of the government in its removal. So if we look at what this is really all about, it has moved to this period of time, 1520. Menahem exacted money from Israel, so the king of Assyria turned back, did not come to the land. When they look at all of this in the governance of what was going on and placing other people to rule and to run it, they neglected to cover 1520, is when they began to make them a vassal state, taking all their money from them and left them in the hands to be able to come in and govern them. All right, so I know I went through that real fast, so you can go back to the restoration or the rebirth of Israel. It's online, you can get it in more detail, but what am I trying to tell you here? At this point of time, when they came in to attack Israel, Israel paid them tribute. They took all the money from Israel and left them in a very poor vassal state, so that when they reached this stage a few years later, they just simply came in and took power and control without a war. In the United States, we have been turning over our money and our finances, and we're giving it to everybody in the world, money we don't have. The United States, whether we realize it or not, is a vassal state. We are bankrupt. We have so many trillions of dollars in debt that we can never pay for it. And now we're talking about another 3 trillion or 5 trillion. And we're talking about, believe it or not, just listen to this, just giving to families. So isn't that nice? We're going to give every kid in America $300 under 17, $360 a month if they're under 5 or 6. Do you realize that government giveaway in 10 years is $1 trillion? $1 trillion, another giveaway. Because once it starts, it's not going to stop. It's built into the system. Where do you come up with that money? In other words, we have been here, and now we're going to a governance coming into America, invited by the president, that puts us right here. Once this happens, you are in the second phase of the removal of your freedoms. Whether you realize it or not, another government comes in to control. That year was 732. And in a little historical box that I showed you before that was up on the screen, back it up, you'll read 732. They misplaced the dates of 745 that should be 732 because they missed this, just a few verses before. 1776, 1803, as we showed the restoration, and look at that date, the Constitution of the United States. So ancient Israel lost its governance, it returns its governance. So what are we looking at here? The beginning of the removal of Israel's wealth, the beginning of their loss of governance, the beginning of their loss of identity of ancient Israel. Now look at this. This is absolutely crazy, but it's true. The beginning of the restoration of wealth, the beginning of the restoration of self-governance, and the beginning of the fulfillment of the destiny of America. As Israel went into captivity, so they came out of captivity. But God says there's going to be another captivity coming, and we are going back into captivity just like God said they did in ancient Israel: removal of wealth, removal of governance, and removal of our nation. And Jesus Christ says he's going to have to come get us out of captivity one more time when he returns. When you see the United States having other governments come in to run us, you have just given up your Constitution. 1776, 1789, and 1803. Now watch this. 27 years total, 20 years restoration total. Isn't that amazing what God said? Because he says a day is a year. 2,520 years. To the year, to the day, just like God promised. 2,520 years, all the way across. 3 waves, 2,520 years in each one of those waves. This is an amazing story that this country does not understand. If they could understand this principle, they would be quaking in their boots for what this administration just did to try to bring in another government to govern the United States. All right. Another tough program. But let's get moving on. Let's begin to wrap it up. From the Home Office, in the mail last week, The Pilgrim Journey by Joe Shuster, in part 2 of What's Happening to America? Is History Repeating Itself? And by the way, it is. Last week, I did part 2 on the Resurrecting the Beast of Revelation. It's online. You can go take a look at it. You really need to get into that and look at it a couple times to familiar yourself with what prophecy is talking about. Also online, if you have last week's email alert, I think you can find it online too, on the website, here's a chart. This is a chart historically showing all the connections of all the kingdoms from Daniel 2 all the way through to the time of Jesus Christ. Print that out. You can have your own copy and begin to familiarize yourself with that. So we're going to talk more about that in a couple of weeks when I do part 3 of that sermon series. So that's it. That's it for our program today. As we do every week, we're going to try to bring you something a little uplifting. And this is a powerful little video, encouraging video, a joyride. So let's take you on a joyride. Well, that's it. That's for our program today. A lot of important stuff. So I hope you'll take some time and go through this and back it up every now and then and watch what's going on. Take a part of that program. And remember, if we ask each and every week, share this with everyone you know. They're going to love you for it. Or not. Till next week, God be with you.